Thank you, Joshua. Yes, just by way of introduction, he is very much correct. So I belong to a religious order within the Catholic tradition known as the Order of Preachers, founded by St. Dominic about 800 years ago, and we continue on the tradition. I'll be talking a little bit about some major figures from the order who were important within the realm of the sciences and theology, so we'll come back to that in just a moment. But this is part two of a presentation that I gave last time. So I'm going to begin with kind of a quick overview of how I concluded with the previous presentation on faith and reason. But then I'm going to go into kind of a preliminary philosophical overview, some stuff that's good to have in your back pocket to kind of understand the issues of what does it mean to have scientific thinking, what are the history of the natural sciences and this sort of thing. And then I'm going to get into basically a historical overview of ancient Christianity and medieval Christianity and their relationship to the sciences, which is important for understanding the development later on in the modern era, quote unquote, in terms of the development of the empirical sciences. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of contemporary situation today, both in terms of conflict and collaboration. If you were expecting today, if expecting anything at all, of a deep overview of the whole Galileo affair or the Scopes monkey trial or anything, we don't have time for that. But I'll provide some resources at the end for you to do your own study. And then I'll make some final comments as to how we can approach the sciences today as Christians, but also how we can encourage the sciences to also respect religious belief also. And hopefully we'll have a little time for Q&A, but this is going to be a packed presentation. So put your seatbelts on, because here we go. Okay. So last time, basically how I closed out things with the talk on faith and reason is just basically making the point that when we posit faith and reason against one another, it actually defeats both in some ways. They're not the same, but neither are they in conflict, nor are they separable when it comes to being a Christian in the world today. Otherwise, if we cut them off from one another, then reason and faith kind of turn inwards and just kind of spiral down, right? Neither has a place to ground it. Now, one thing that we can affirm as Christians philosophically is that it seems that reason kind of indicates its own limits and it points beyond itself. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the sciences specifically. And I quoted Pope John Paul II, who was a very famous pope in the 20th century and 21st slightly within the Catholic tradition, who wrote a lot on faith and reason. And one of the points he makes that is constant throughout the Christian tradition in many different denominations, including Catholic, is that faith perfects and builds upon reason, right? They're not in conflict because one completes the other, essentially, is the idea, and neither violates the other. And so faith confirms what we can know by reason and also reveals what we cannot, right? There are certain things that we cannot know for the sake of our salvation through reason alone. And so what Christians are called to do is to try to seek some sort of mutual coherence between the two, right? To move beyond this kind of conflict idea. And the hope is that the proper application of reason purifies faith, and the proper application of faith purifies reason, and this kind of mutual sort of thing going on, right? And that each provoke the other to deeper understanding. That when we think reason has gotten it all, that faith comes along and says, oh yeah, and shatters it, right? But on the other hand, that when we think that like our faith can't grow anymore, right? Then we bring in reason as well, and we say, well, is that the best way to understand it? We go deeper, right? This is what we always have to be open to as Christians today. And one thing that we can take confidence in, and one of the things I was trying to encourage in my previous presentation, is that we should really consider faith and reason sort of on a level playing field, just in terms of human cognition, right? The human ability to know. That neither has a human advantage, because in the end, all of us are going to have to make a choice as to what to believe, even in terms of reason, even in terms of the natural sciences, right? That the natural sciences don't interpret themselves, but we have to make human judgments as to what is most plausible, what is most true, and so forth. And part of that, as I'll come back to in kind of our philosophical background, is that human knowing itself is inductive. We learn from experience, right? And that's whether it's in the realm of faith, that's whether it's in the realm of reason. But what we as Christians maintain is that what actually gives faith, though, is grace, right? God's grace is what empowers belief in what is revealed by God. That's not something that comes from us, right? So that's the one kind of exception within the Christian view. But in general, when we look at the human person, how we know is through inductive reason. That is, we take the data before us and we infer to the most plausible solution of what it all means, right? And so the natural sciences are a critical realm for us to kind of consider this sort of stuff, what I talked about in the previous presentation regarding faith and reason. So let's get into some preliminary sort of philosophical stuff. You can't talk about the natural sciences without talking about Aristotle. Aristotle, Greek philosopher, student of Plato, responding a lot to what Plato believed with his own sort of maybe more earthly approach in a way, bottom up rather than Plato's top down, had an outsized impact on the Western tradition, but in particular in the realm of the natural sciences because of Aristotle's vision, breadth, depth, and his method, which was beginning this kind of empirical study of the world. In fact, Aristotle is so interesting and so groundbreaking that he basically single-handedly invented the field of biology, basically 2,500 years ago. So take a look at that. I mean, it's pretty impressive when you think about that, right? To invent an entire field of study, but that's what he was good at. But most relevant to the sciences, at least in terms of kind of bigger picture stuff, was his systematic cosmology. He took very seriously this idea that what we do first is we observe the world around us, right? Data. And then we have to infer by induction what is the most reasonable causal explanation as to why this gives rise to this, where does such and such come from, and so forth. And ultimately what we want to achieve is universal explanations, right? Everything operates in such and such a way, right? And so this is where he comes up with his idea of the four causes. This is where he comes up with the idea of living things being composed of both form and matter, which today we can kind of understand as soul and body and this sort of thing. So this is Aristotle's basic method. And what he was very good at was trying to seek common explanations for everything in sort of observable and unobservable reality, from the most earthly up into the starry heavens and so forth. And so this is where a lot of his influence comes from. It's, again, this breadth and the systematic aspect of his thought. However, as Aristotelianism is inherited within the Christian tradition, there's going to be some things that have to be worked through. For instance, one of the things he posited, and that certain Christians would later on argue against, even in the ancient world, folks like John Philoponus, who nobody knows about, but fascinating character, is this kind of two-realm theory, right? That like the terrestrial, everything below the moon that we see is made of one, the four elements, but then the starry heavens beyond are made of a fifth element, right? The, what is it called? Ether, right? The celestial ether and that sort of thing, which creates a heterogeneous universe such that what we infer here doesn't necessarily apply up there except in kind of a perfected form. So maybe this is where he's still holding on to some of the Platonic values. Even more conflictual, though, is the idea that the cosmos is all there is. So a sort of kind of naturalism, in a way, where even God, as the unmoved mover, the first cause, is part of the cosmos. And weirdly enough, in some ways, isn't even aware of his own bringing of the cosmos into being and the motion of the spheres and stuff like this. So that's a little problematic when we start not being able to make a proper distinction between God and creation. And again, from his naturalism, that his metaphysics, which is really a theology, right, is a direct product of his natural philosophy. So there's no way to kind of separate the two, in a way. The way that we understand what is up there is only based on what we understand here, and there's really not anything like revelation that can happen, for instance. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Another thing, and this is a constant theme throughout a lot of philosophical history, was debating whether or not the world was eternal, and does that threaten God's eternity or not, right? And so this is going to be a consistent thing that's debated down through the centuries after Aristotle. Basically, if I were to kind of summarize it in one line, it's that problematic for Christians with Aristotle's thought was that in some ways he made an insufficient separation of theology and science. Now that may seem kind of strange for me to say as a Christian, and this is really important when we think about the boundaries of inquiry, right? Is the natural scientist able to make theological conclusions or metaphysical conclusions as a scientist and this sort of thing, right? Aristotle would have said, well, of course, right? What the philosopher is after is total knowledge, right? But as we'll see, it's a bit more complicated than that. Okay? So the threat, basically, with Aristotle down through time is that, for instance, revelation is made incoherent. Why and how would God actually reveal anything when he's unaware of the world that he's the final cause of and this sort of thing? But also a highly deterministic natural world, right? That all the spheres orbit on a constant sort of thing and they influence motion below on Earth. And, you know, is there such a thing as free will, for instance? Right? So this is some of the other stuff that's going to be debated down through time. Okay. Now, intro to modern philosophy of science. This is important to notice, and I'll keep coming back to themes from this, which is why I introduce it here. Okay. Aristotle had a robust epistemology, fancy word for a theory of knowledge, right? How do we know what we know? And we see this both in his prior analytics, which is all about deductive inferences, and his posterior analytics, which is, oh wait, that's not right. Okay, so what was his posterior analytics? Okay, it was rather about inductive inferences, okay? So a deductive inference is 2 plus ergo 4, right? That would be logical inference and this sort of thing. That's not the same as what we do in the natural sciences, though. What we make are inductive inferences, and Aristotle himself says that's the basic of scientific knowledge, right? That we take data about the world, and we, using our human judgment, have to infer to the best explanation, right? But you notice that's not a necessary conclusion. That's just the best explanation we have, right? So this is really important. Whereas 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a necessary conclusion, logically. Okay, that's kind of the idea behind all this. And modern philosophy of science actually would agree with all of this. For instance, if you think about it, whatever data we take in the world is empirical data that only tells us what has happened. It cannot tell us what will happen. And so if you go, fast forward to the modern philosophical area with people like David Hume and the kind of empiricist British tradition, right? When he says you cannot derive an ought from an is, what he specifically is talking about there is that you can't take what's happened before and absolutely say what will be in the future, right? Some people use it as kind of a moral relativism thing, but what he was talking about was empirical theory, right? That you can't go from a series of data points into the future with absolute necessary whatever, okay? So this is really important, and this is actually helpful to understanding what science is and kind of making room for God in a way, even though David Hume himself probably was more of an atheist, right? What this helps us recognize is that empirical sciences themselves are grounded in axiomatic beliefs. We have to start with beliefs about the world and then do science. And what are those? Well, first of all, that both spatially and temporally, down through time, that the universe is ordered and is consistent. That is, what's happened in the past will happen again, and if we go anywhere in space, practically, it's the same. Okay? So this is what the natural sciences have to basically assume, and they more or less are validated by the data, but we can't make a necessary conclusion, right? That there's no such thing as like laws imposed from without, but rather regularities of nature that we can figure out that are not necessary, but contingent is the opposite of that. Contingent on what? Well, Christians would say God, right? Like God's will is what actually makes this ultimately possible. But philosophers of science would also agree, based on David Hume and others, that it's like there's no necessary conclusion one can reach about all of this. We have to assume an ordered, consistent universe. And furthermore, when we just think about things epistemologically, as I've kind of stated already in previous slides, that it's human beings ultimately that have to judge what is probable or plausible. You don't just fit data into a computer and ask the computer what the answer is. We make the computer help us figure out what the answers are. But ultimately, we have to say, I believe, right? And that is a human judgment and maybe kind of an unbridgeable gap in a way, something that makes us truly reasonable human beings, is that we can do what computers and other things cannot do. We can make judgments, right? And this is very important to the gift of reason. But with every human judgment comes assumptions about the world. There's no way to get rid of all absolutely a priori assumptions. We have to start with something. And the something that we start from is our experience of the world and the best explanation as to how we see what we see today in a predictable way. Now, a caution here, all right, is that this is not an encouragement towards skepticism towards science, right, or the natural sciences, but rather an encouragement to not be naive when you are looking at scientific results and this sort of thing, right? Neither skepticism nor naivete, rather the kind of like middle position is the sort of critical realist position. That is, we're really reaching true things about the world, but there's always deeper and deeper and deeper to go. We never arrive at the answer, right? And people still debate this within the sciences, the philosophy of science, and that sort of thing. Okay. All right, long-winded introduction, but this is really important in terms of the sort of theoretical background of what we're going to talk from here on out. Okay. So let's talk about the sciences within Christian history. Okay. One thing, when people look back at Christian history, they think a lot of Christians are basically fundamentalists, right? They said, Bible alone, we're good, right? But that's actually not true. But where this comes from is, for instance, people like Tertullian, right? If you go back to the church father from the 2nd century, 3rd century, Tertullian, he gives this famous line in his work Adversus Heresis, right? Against all heresies. And what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That is, what do we care what the Greek philosophers have to say over in Athens? We have the Bible, we have Revelation, never mind all that crap, right? So that's kind of the idea here. However, if we actually look at what's going on when such statements are made, in the Christian tradition, a lot of it is rhetoric, okay? Rhetorical tactics against non-believers, okay? And against heretics, basically, who were perceived as misusing philosophy to come up with bad theology, okay? To make the point that, look, reason is inherently limited, and revelation is what ultimately gives us certainty. So this is what statements like, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, are coming from, right? A hyperbolic rhetorical point to make the point that for the Christian, ultimately determinative is what God has said, and not what human reason can conclude unaided by God. Okay? But if we actually look at the breadth of ancient Christian intellectual life, what we find rather is many, many people who were highly educated and who valued natural knowledge to a high degree. So for instance, Justin Martyr, or Origen of Alexandria, or Basil of Caesarea, right? We go to their writings and they had a huge appreciation, not only for kind of the like sort of rigorous natural philosophical sort of stuff, but also even arts and culture and literature and this sort of thing, right? Even taken from the surrounding pagan culture. Now, they filtered, right? They kind of separated the wheat from the chaff, but nevertheless, they valued it, right? They thought that it was okay. They didn't go around just smashing statues all over the place, right? And they believed, why, is that secular culture and knowledge is one of the things that can help us understand revelation, right? We got the written word, we've got the spoken word. How do you understand these things without actually cultivating your reason in a holistic way? And some even claimed, for instance, Justin Martyr, right? He would have argued as one of the early apologists that, in fact, Christianity is the fulfillment of all philosophy. But if you're going to have a fulfillment of all philosophy, you need to know philosophy, right? So this is kind of the thing that is assumed by all of this. But what Christianity brings, what God's revelation brings, is a proper ordering of philosophy by God, through grace, and to God. But this would be the basis, for instance, of Justin Martyr's and others' so-called Logos Christology, where they looked at the prologue of the Gospel of John, and they're like, well, wait a second, this says the word. Well, that Greek word is logos, right? And that was also the Greek word for kind of the order or reason behind the nature of created reality. And so they're like, well, you got this and you got this, huh? How about that, right? Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of what all the Greek philosophers are looking for. That's a strong apologetic point right there. Right. Now, in our tradition, right, within the Latin Western tradition of Christianity, Augustine of Hippo is very helpful with regards to teasing all of this sort of stuff out. He, like others, rhetorically, had the understanding that natural reason and knowledge are secondary in value, ultimately. Right? And in fact, that natural learning can be a snare of sorts, distracting from the pursuit of holiness. Curiositas, right? That just learning for learning's sake. Well, that's not helpful, right? It has to be ordered towards something higher. Further, that so-called earthly wisdom, or the wisdom of men, often encourages pride and not humility. And humility is what is valuable for the Christian, pride being the deadliest of sins. Further, you don't need to understand nature in order to be saved, right? And this is kind of this egalitarian intellectual ethic of the Christian tradition, which is everybody is free to understand things to their furthest capacity, but you don't have to be an egghead to be saved, right? You don't have to know everything. You don't have to be the smartest. And in fact, because of the encouragement of pride and not humility, it can be some of the lesser people, IQ-wise, right, who actually end up being the holiest and the most filled with the charity of God and so forth. So I think that this is valuable from Augustine. However, he would also say, yet this stuff is still very valuable, right? Even though the knowledge of revelation is most important for the sake of faith, whatever is true belongs to Christians because it comes from the first truth, which is Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, right? So whatever we can discover as true in the world belongs to God and therefore belongs to the Christian. And so we can welcome that. We can take that for ourselves. Further, he even makes statements in works such as his literal commentary on Genesis, or literal interpretation of Genesis. In one major portion, great work if you can find it. It's kind of hard to track down in some libraries, but he makes the point that Christians should not give scandal to non-Christians by speaking ignorantly about creation, right? He makes the point that people can know lots of stuff about the world. Oh, yeah, by the way, that the world is round, not flat, right? Nobody actually believed that, for the most part, who was educated remotely back in the ancient world, right? But then if somebody comes along and says, oh no, look at Genesis, right? It's clearly flat, right? And Augustine would say, stop, right? Because basically what you're doing is you're impacting that person's ability to hear the gospel, right? And yes, we know it's a grace-filled phenomenon of being given the gift of faith and so forth, but nevertheless, that impacts you with regards to how well you represent the gospel. And so we have to be careful when we're thinking about giving scandal or not, right? And also, Augustine, with many other, would make the point that natural knowledge and learning is the handmaiden of theology, right? That we actually can know revelation and understand God's will better the more that we understand about the world and so forth. And so this kind of handmaiden model of how natural learning can feed into theology is something that would continue to develop through the ancient period into the medieval and beyond. Okay. Speaking of which, we get into the medieval era, right? Often known as the Dark Ages, right? And I hope you all understand that that's basically just propaganda, for the most part, invented by later Renaissance thinkers to justify their own intellectual project, okay? Now, there was kind of a dark period, right, with the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire and this sort of thing. But much of ancient learning, what can be salvaged, was maintained in monasteries, preserved, carried forward, brought into encyclopedias, blah, blah, blah. And eventually, by the time you get to a guy like Charlemagne in the 9th century, he's got a huge library in Aachen, Germany, with 7,000 plus manuscripts stored there that are then scribally copied and distributed all throughout the entire empire, right? So lots of renaissances down the way after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. You also got key figures like Boethius, one of my heroes, who managed, before he was brutally executed by a pagan king, or not a pagan king, Arian king. He managed to transmit the entire liberal arts model of education into the Latin-speaking world from the Greek through his translation project, which is going to be the basis of later developments of universities. And he also translated as much as he could of Aristotle and other philosophers into Latin. For Aristotle, though, he only got as far as his logical works, okay? So we'll see why that's important in a little bit. John Scotus Erigenia, for instance, was fluent in Greek and even promoted Aristotle's logical methods and this sort of thing, okay? And eventually we have schools attached to cathedrals by the 10th century, from the monasteries having dominance within the educational sphere. And we get the universities, first universities all over the world, really, by the time we get to 1200 AD. Okay. So this is kind of the development of the Western intellectual tradition, very quick. Very important, though, with regards to the natural sciences, is a centuries-long renaissance that actually began in the 11th century, following upon the Spanish Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. Because once Toledo was conquered, its libraries were made available to the Latin-speaking West from there. And so there began a Latin translation movement, where all of a sudden, all of these Arabic language copies of ancient works are discovered. The Latin-speaking West is like, whoa, we didn't know this stuff existed, right? And they begin to translate these into Latin, and then they start going east to the Byzantine Empire to start gathering manuscripts from Greek and start translating those. So you got from both the Greek and the Arabic speaking, all this flood of new knowledge into the Western tradition from there on out, and being absorbed by the universities very quickly, including many unknown, very many unknown Aristotelian works. Remember that Boethius only got so far in his translation of Aristotle, and so all of this was just opened up a whole new world for people during this time. And this is what would lay the groundwork, this centuries-long Renaissance, for the 15th century and 16th century Renaissance, following upon the birth of Christian humanism with people like Petrarch and Dante and all these wonderful people, right? But everything has a history, and this is what we have to remember. And this was a centuries-long process before we get to the Renaissance, right? With a capital R, everybody talks about. Now, I did mention that, there were some contributions from my humble order. For instance, Albert the Great, right up here. Albertus Magnus, he was called the Great in his own lifetime, right? That doesn't happen very often. I don't know of anybody, like maybe Alexander the Great, for instance. But even maybe he didn't get that appellation until afterwards. I don't know. But in many ways, Albert the Great was the first responder to this new influx of Aristotle into the Latin-speaking West. At the behest of his fellow brothers of my order, he began a 20-year project of commenting on the entire corpus of Aristotle's works, both in natural philosophy and also natural history as well, which is highly unusual for his time, okay? People had a great interest in natural philosophy, that is, the general principles for how the world works. But it's surprising to us when we go back is that down through the ancient period and medieval period, very few people had an interest in the concrete particulars of the world, right? So lots of interest, for instance, in the general notion of a tree, but not a lot of interest in, like, why does that tree have those particular nuances, those particular properties? He was practically alone amongst his contemporaries in terms of having an interest in this sort of thing, and made this wealth of knowledge much more available to others, especially within my order, but also belong. Okay. He's also alone amongst his contemporaries for his own scientific outlook. He did original research following upon his kind of research into Aristotle, of starting to look into local flora and fauna and minerals and all this sort of stuff. So he's just a fascinating character. But beyond just being a very forward-thinking kind of scientific figure at that time, also very much known for his holiness, his fidelity to Christ, and service to the church, right? That none of that was in conflict with one another. And of course, Albert the Great was the teacher of the famous St. Thomas Aquinas as well. Okay, so had a huge influence on Thomas, especially in his use of Aristotle for basically the first systematic theology in the entire Western Christian tradition, if not the entire Christian tradition. And what do I mean by systematic? I mean that you're not just answering particular questions this way and that, but you're actually using an entire framework, philosophical, intellectual, and so forth, to show how it all fits together in total, right? This is what I mean by systematic, and this, as far as I know, he's the first one to really do that, and his most famous work, of course, the Summa Theologiae, where, you can just tell by how it's formulated, his kind of mindset with regards to how all this stuff works together. He starts with God, down through creation, down to the human race, and Jesus Christ as the bridge back to God, basically, right? So that's kind of how to read his work ultimately. Now, in the midst of this, okay, just 2 points I'll make from very, very early on in the first part of the Summa Theologia, really the first question, okay? He makes the point that theology is a science like any other. How so? Well, it has its own principles, right? It has its own data, right? And it has its own rules for inferring, for really deducing from the data to the conclusions in a proper way, and that's what makes it a proper science. Okay, sort of like the principles of geometry make optics possible. He basically says, well, divine revelation makes theology possible, right? And the human reason has to work it all together, right, in a deductive way within its own sphere, right? So it starts with its own assumptions and keeps moving from there. What's important about this, okay, why I bring this up is that what that does when he does that is he circumscribes the realm of theology, and by implication also allows other sciences to have their own field of view as well, right? And so that both protects theology from bad incursion from philosophy, right? But also gives philosophy its own integrity as well, including natural philosophy. So that's pretty cool. And yet he also says, natural science, natural philosophy is the handmaiden to theology. Ultimately, all knowledge must be ordered towards understanding God and his revelation more perfectly. Okay? And this is what allows us to make this transition into the modern sciences as they will develop from here on out. Okay? Interestingly enough, not something people know a lot about, about 15 more minutes, I think we'll be okay, is that conflicts over Aristotle actually built the road to the modern sciences. If we go back a little bit with the new influx of Aristotle into the Western Christian tradition, this is a hotly contested project because of some of the things I was talking about previously that could be problematic for Christians from the works of Aristotle. Okay? But not only were his theological conclusions problematic in certain ways, but with the influx of Aristotle from the Arabic-speaking world came many Islamic commentators on Aristotle, and they also made conclusions that were not very complimentary towards Christian belief. Okay? And so we have this kind of gives rise within the Latin-speaking tradition, so-called Latin Averroism. That is, that only Aristotelianism is philosophy, and Averroes, which is one of the most famous Islamic commentators, is his prophet. Okay, for those of you who know anything about Islam, you get the joke. Okay, Albert and Aquinas really worked hard to kind of wrest Aristotle from this movement of the kind of absolute Aristotelians who only allowed Averroes to be the proper commentator and that sort of thing, right? But eventually, during the 13th century, Aquinas dies young, Albert gets old, and there are many intellectual and political enemies that have been built up against kind of this Aristotelian sort of thing going on. And it reaches its climax in the 1277 Paris condemnations of 216 propositions by the local bishop. Okay, this is not necessarily universal, not a universal condemnation by the church at this time, but a local sort of thing going on in the area of Paris because it had the most influential university during the 13th century. Okay. Now, what was hard about this is that some of Aquinas' own work was kind of lumped in with this condemnation until his canonization in 1323. And these condemnations deal with many different issues, namely kind of rebuking the arts faculty, so the natural philosophers and others, for kind of denigrating theology, right, in order to set up their own territory. Also kind of maintaining this sort of double truth idea that you can reach one conclusion in natural philosophy and another in theology, and you just kind of hold those in your head at the same time. That's not going to work. Okay? And also condemnations of certain propositions of Aristotle's theology, for instance, the eternity of the world and this sort of thing. Okay? Now, what was vital in all of this, the main thing to get out of these condemnations that will be important for later natural sciences, is the condemnations against anything limiting God's creative power. Right? This idea that somehow God is constrained by his own intellect to only do things one way. Right? Rather, what was being affirmed in these condemnations that God could do anything the way he wants, right? And so therefore God's power demands investigation of nature. This is the really interesting thing about this. Okay, there were profound effects intellectually in the Western tradition that followed upon all of this. First of all, the sort of promotion of voluntarism, as it's called, right? The prioritization of God's will, not bound by anything within God a priori in some way. And this is developed from kind of going back to Augustine, right? Of saying, well, maybe Augustine's Neoplatonism was a little bit more safe. Let's kind of avoid this Thomistic, Aristotelian, whatever, right? But this prioritization of God's will is very important because what that means ultimately is that because God's will is inscrutable, we can't just know it, right, in some sort of deductive way, then therefore, the only way we can know what is in God's will is ultimately by what he reveals, right? It's not deducible. So we can't look at creation, therefore, and say, well, God only could have willed it this way, ergo, this must be the conclusion. The second effect in this emphasis on God's power is the amplification of so-called nominalist philosophy. Okay, and this is kind of a side current thing going on. And nominalist philosophy maintains that only individual things have reality, that universals are only such in name. So for instance, there's no such thing as the nature of a tree. All trees are just individual concrete things. Whatever similarities we see between them, we construct in our heads as universal, right? So it's very subjectivist in that regard. And there's truth to that, but you can take that too far, because then you might be asking, like, is there such a thing as human nature? Is there anything that unites us as human beings, right? What's the basis of having a common dignity when you can't say that there's a human nature? So I'll let you think about that as you go. But it made the same kind of point, is that because all things are individual in particular, you have to actually experience them in order to know the truth about them. You can't just deduce it from some construct in your head of what the nature of this, that, and the other thing is. And so both of these kind of currents at this point, by emphasizing God's creative power, we're encouraging a certain epistemic humility, right? Humility with regards to what we know, and in particular even towards God's creation. If God is the Aristotelian final cause of all things, because we can't know God's will, that's all we're left with, right? And so natural causation has to be discovered through induction, not deduction, right? We have to actually take data about the world and find out how the world actually works, not assume that we can figure that out from what we think we know of God's will. Okay. Now, what's important about all this then is that the medievals, through all of this, laid the groundwork for the modern sciences, both philosophically, but even in terms of scientific method in some cases. So a short list of people you've probably rarely heard of, if ever, people like Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, Nicholas of Cusa, Nicholas Oresme, John Buridan, many others worked in optics and mathematics and this sort of thing. And a lot of this groundwork that they worked out was primarily philosophical, going further back. And actually was facilitated by this idea of natural philosophy being a handmaid. Because if natural philosophy is a handmaid and a servant of theology, then that means it must have its own integrity as well in some ways, right? And this is why after the 13th century in general, the Western Church was fairly laissez-faire and even supportive of natural philosophy. Once you got the borders worked out, we're good, right? We don't need to interfere too much. Another thing, wish I could discuss this more, but this idea of secondary causality was very popular within the Christian intellectual tradition, which gives nature a real, if dependent, autonomy, right? That nature actually causes things itself. It's not just God moving a bunch of billiard balls around, right? But rather God sustains his own creation in causing things within itself. And finally, nominalism, emphasizing so-called material and efficient causality, right? What is matter? How does cause and effect come about? That's all very important here. But also some of what was done in the medieval era laid the seeds of scientific methodology as well. So for instance, because of Aristotle, increasing emphasis on the empirical methods of studying the world, and even a growing application of mathematics to natural observations, whether, again, in optics or any of these other sorts of things. Okay. And yet there were also theological considerations, and based on time, we'll see how far I get from here, but this is a really important one too, is that religious faith during this time also impelled many technological advances too. In particular, a kind of revivalism of a sort of apocalypticism during the medieval period. Now, that could be driven by a lot of sort of stuff, right? But for instance, for Roger Bacon, prior to the Black Death, right? So it wasn't just the Black Death that caused this, but Roger Bacon looked at the advances being made in technology, the sciences, human knowledge, and this sort of thing. And what he interpreted that is that these are God's gifts for preparing creation for the second coming of Christ, right? To reestablish human dominion over the world in preparation for the second coming. This is very interesting, I think. And this is spurred on even more so by the time we get the discovery of the Americas by Western Europe, right? Where all of a sudden the gospel needs to be preached. Maybe we will finally preach the gospel to all people, and then finally Christ will come again, right? As promised. So all of this kind of apocalyptic fervor down through these centuries actually drove a lot of technological advance because of this anticipation of reestablishing human dominion in preparation for the coming of Christ. And so this is where we get also the birth of utopian literature during this time that I think Thomas More was more responding to than actually writing himself, right? He's kind of critiquing a lot of this sort of stuff. All right. So as natural philosophy developed, so too the model of thought of how natural philosophy and theology can relate to one another. Because there was a need to justify natural philosophy as an independent discipline a little bit more than what the so-called handmaiden model could really provide. And so this starts to loosen up significantly, and you see kind of the revival during the medieval period, especially later on, of this so kind of, this like two books model now, where we've got the book of creation and the book of Revelation, and both have the same divine author, and so it's important to know both, basically. And really, this goes all the way back to Origen, and Augustine even talks this way, and then you get to people like Galileo Galilei. They're all talking this way. However, if you have two books, this only works as long as scholars stay within their own bounds, right? That they understand when I'm doing theology over here, I'm not doing natural science. When I'm doing natural science over here, I'm not doing theology, right? And if you want to know the background of the Galileo affair, that's it right there, right? Boundary crossing in a lot of ways today. So we're coming up on time, about 5 minutes left. I think I'm probably just going to kind of skip some of this, because how do I want to summarize at the end? Let's see. I think I just want to end here, okay? There is a lot that can be talked about in terms of the interaction of Christianity and science from there on out. Again, I don't go into much detail on this because I think it's necessary to just kind of study this stuff yourself to a certain degree. But after decades of historical study, we have a much more complex picture of the kind of mutual development of Christian faith and the natural sciences down through time. It is true that it seems like Christians have opposed certain maybe apparent scientific ideas, but actually it's not remotely close to what is often kind of perceived as this like war on science by religion and this sort of thing. Really an idea that only comes about in the 19th century. Okay, so it doesn't have that long of a pedigree. What I'd say is that everybody's to blame for the conflictual events, which are fairly rare, actually, when you look down through time, for not kind of practicing a bit more charity and patience with one another to deal with things. It is true that sometimes Christians were too quick to practice guilt by association, right? So, for instance, if you want to know the origins of the Scopes monkey trial, look to the fact that anti-evolution bills were being passed all over the United States during that period of time, the early 20th century, not because of evolution itself, but because of so-called social Darwinism, okay, which was an ethical, social, and political movement in terms of how to deal with people, okay, that had impacts on the teaching of evolution in schools, and therefore created a reaction from the scientific community to say, whoop, hold up, okay, so this is something we have to be careful of, guilt by association as Christians. However, it's also true that secular scholars have been too quick to overstep scientific boundaries as well, right? For instance, Galileo, go check it out, right? And even many popularizers of science today making stupid statements about, God, the universe, and all the world, and that sort of thing, when really they're most qualified to talk about physics or biology, okay? And just shut up otherwise, right? This is the issue. Okay. And so, really, looking at both Christians and secular scientists today, okay, we have to be very careful about in an undisciplined way transgressing boundaries, because that eventually leads to territorial conflicts that are not necessary. Okay, so I think the solution here is, forgive us our trespasses, as we say in the Lord's Prayer, right? That we should respect the integrity of the natural sciences and welcome the results from them, and kind of practice the sifting of wheat from chaff, of course. At the same time, I think the natural scientists have to be reminded, right, that they don't have a hegemony on the intellectual and political life of the world, right? There are many other things that have to be brought into play when we're talking about how to order ourselves for the sake of the common good. And so mutual respect and dialogue really are the only ways forward, I think. Okay. If you want to take a picture of that, you can look up stuff later. These are some resources I highly recommend for the future. I've used the Ferengren collection in classes I've taught. I also think Ronald Number's book, Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, is an excellent place to begin. Just like 25 chapters on different topics by different academics. It's just, both of these are great resources. Also, if you're interested more in the philosophy of science, the very short introduction series of books is a great way to get into anything, so check that out. And then, of course, anything from the Thomistic Institute, so that's our brothers over in the Eastern Province, or the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. What I like about Peter Adamson's work with this podcast is he takes very seriously the religious influences on later intellectual development. So leave it at that. Thank you, everybody. And we are about at time, so I'll stick around if you want to ask questions, but I know I got to clean up. So thanks for being here today. God bless you.